The heavy doors of the Los Angeles County Courthouse swung open with an almost reluctant creak, as if they themselves were tired of witnessing stories like this. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, a kind of quiet tension that wrapped itself around every seat in the gallery. The room was full, a collection of strangers drawn together by the promise of something worth watching. Most came for entertainment, some for justice, and at the center of it all stood a young man who didn't quite fit the image they'd expected. Jalen Dawson, just 19, stood at the defendant's table. He was dressed plainly, jeans, a simple button-down, no expensive suit to impress the jury. His hands stayed buried deep in his pockets, as if he had to physically restrain himself from giving away too much. His chin tilted ever so slightly upward, not in defiance, but in quiet refusal to shrink beneath the weight of their judgment. He had the look of someone who'd already accepted the worst they could throw at him. Except for his eyes. They said something else entirely. Across the room, Judge Walter Grayson watched the young man with a tired sort of interest. Grayson was an old-school kind of judge, the type who had seen every excuse, every tearful plea, every clever trick. He sat higher than everyone else in that polished mahogany chair, like he was perched on the edge of an old, weary world that had nothing left to surprise him. His gavel rested loosely under one hand, his fingers tapping out a slow rhythm that matched his impatience. As Jalen waited, Grayson pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and gave him a look. The kind of look a man gives a kid who's wandered too far out of his lane. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson asked, his voice dry, the words trailing out slowly like he already knew the punchline. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles broke out from the benches. The bailiff smirked. Even the court stenographer cracked a faint grin, and Mitchell Carrington, the state prosecutor, couldn't hide his amusement. It was the laughter of people who'd seen this play out before. Another young man who thought he was smarter than the system. They were used to watching the system win. But Jalen didn't move, didn't smile. He'd been preparing for this moment in ways they couldn't imagine. Not standing in this courtroom as a defendant, no, but he'd prepared all the same. While other kids on his block memorized the names of their favorite athletes or the lyrics of the latest songs, Jalen memorized statutes, dissected case law, and studied legal precedent like it was gospel. While his friends played ball in the street, he staged mock trials alone in his bedroom, arguing both sides of imaginary cases until he could predict the outcome before the closing arguments even started. His mother, Denise Dawson, had spent over 2 decades working as a paralegal. And in their small apartment, those stories she brought home from work were as common as bedtime tales. She told him about the prosecutors who cut corners and the defense lawyers who gave up before the fight began. She talked about judges who played favorites, about juries swayed more by fear than facts. Jalen had listened to all of it, absorbed every word. By the time he was 14, he could take apart a trial in his head and put it back together again without breaking a sweat. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To the judge, Jalen was just another statistic in an endless parade of young men in trouble. Just another face that would blur into the next one, when the docket flipped to a new name. Grayson sighed, flipping open the file like he was bored before it even began. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. "I've got a golf game at 2. That drew another round of laughter from the courtroom, but something subtle shifted then. Jalen's mouth quirked upward. Just a little. A private reaction, gone before anyone could register it. Because Grayson had already made his first mistake. He just didn't know it yet. The prosecutor rose with a practiced ease. Carrington was everything his reputation suggested. Polished, confident, sure of himself in the way men like him always seemed to be. His suit was impeccable, his tie knotted with precision, and his voice had the weight of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times, and won 90, 9 of them. The state will prove, Carrington began, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in a stolen 2022 Audi A6. Reported missing just hours before his arrest. His tone was clipped, measured. His eyes flicked to the jury as he paced with deliberate steps. Officers pursued him through downtown Los Angeles, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints, Carrington said with a little flourish of the evidence folder, were found on the steering wheel. He stopped then, allowing the words to settle. The courtroom was still. It was, on the surface, a clean case. A stolen car. A chase. A young man caught and arrested. The evidence, Carrington said without having to say it, spoke for itself. He gave a small shrug as he approached the jury box again. The defense may try to convince you this was all a misunderstanding, Carrington added, his gaze resting briefly on Jalen. That Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? Grayson gave a slow, knowing nod. His fingers resumed their rhythmic tapping. To him, it all made sense. It always did. Another case headed toward an inevitable conclusion. But Jalen stood still. Measuring. He didn't rush to object. He didn't interrupt. Because he'd already seen the cracks forming in their case. It was just a matter of time. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly, more to signal his impatience than order. Let's hear the defense, he said, turning toward Jalen's public defender. Lisa Thornton stood up, a slight woman in an ill-fitting blazer, and cleared her throat. She looked as though she wanted to say something, but before she could, Jalen reached out and placed a steady hand on her arm. She glanced at him, uncertain, then sat back down. I'll be representing myself, Jalen said, his voice clear and steady. You could have heard a pin drop. Then a ripple of laughter. Not from everyone, but enough. Grayson raised an eyebrow, leaning forward like he couldn't believe his luck. You'll what? I'll be defending myself, Jalen repeated. For a moment, the courtroom felt like it held its breath. Carrington chuckled. These should be interesting, he muttered, loud enough for the gallery to hear. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. And that's when everything started to change. He let the silence stretch out, just long enough to make them shift in their seats. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look scared. He looked prepared. And then he spoke. Before we begin, Jalen said, I have a few questions for the prosecution. Carrington crossed his arms, looking bored. Go ahead. You stated. Jalen began. That officer, Daniel Ruiz, personally witnessed me behind the wheel before I was arrested. Carrington gave a short nod. That's correct. And that's documented in his official report. Carrington sighed, already tired of the line of questioning. Wes. Jalen gave a nod. Then he looked at Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony. The judge blinked. On what grounds? Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and gestured casually toward Carrington. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that vehicle. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the pursuit started. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled into something more noticeable. Carrington straightened, his bored expression shifting into something else entirely. What are you talking about? The prosecutor demanded. Jalen stepped forward, just once, then stopped. I'd like to request Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, it should match his location data. Jalen paused. But it won't. And, just like that, the balance tipped. You could feel it. Judge Grayson squinted at Carrington. Counselor. Carrington hesitated. Only a moment. But enough. No objections, he finally said, his voice tight. Jalen took a breath and pressed on. Now about those fingerprints. He turned to the jury, and his tone shifted. He wasn't lecturing them. He was bringing them in. If you go into a store and try on a jacket, then leave, and someone steals it later, are you guilty because your fingerprints were on it? The room was utterly still. The car was parked outside a store earlier that day. Jalen explained. I leaned on it. I opened the door. I was curious, stupid maybe, but I didn't steal it. The jury was listening, really listening. Carrington tried to recover, but it was too late. Jalen wasn't finished. I have here, Jalen said, pulling out a document, a statement from the car's owner, Raymond Whitaker. He described the person who took his car, said he was white. Grayson's hand froze in midair. Jalen held up the statement. Yet here I am. He let the words hang there. The courtroom was no longer on Carrington's side. Grayson knew it. Everyone knew it. And Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto, had just dismantled their case. Judge Grayson sat back slowly, staring at him like he was seeing him for the first time. Case dismissed. His words hung in the air longer than they should have, as if the weight of them was still sinking in. Case dismissed. It was supposed to be the end. The gavel hit the block with a dull, final thud that should have signaled closure. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was shock. Disbelief. As if everyone in the room, including the judge, needed a moment to recalibrate. Jalen didn't move at first. His hands, so steady minutes ago, now slowly unclenched at his sides. The courtroom hadn't erupted into applause. This wasn't a movie. No one cheered. Most didn't even know how to react. Some people in the gallery looked at him like he was a ghost, something they hadn't expected to survive the fire. Others, more cynical ones, just shook their heads, like they couldn't believe they had witnessed someone pull that off. But he had. And for Jalen, that was enough. He gathered his things quietly, slipping papers back into the folder that had never really belonged to his public defender. That file, thick with details and evidence he had chased down himself, felt heavier now. Not because of its weight, because of what it represented. He turned to leave, and for a second it almost felt easy. Until the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen paused, hand on the back of the chair where his lawyer should have been sitting. He didn't turn right away. Part of him wondered if this was some cruel twist, if the judge was going to change his mind, find some obscure loophole that let them haul him back. But when he did turn, Judge Grayson wasn't holding his gavel. He wasn't even pretending to be disinterested anymore. You should consider law school, Grayson said. His voice wasn't mocking this time. It wasn't tired or sarcastic. It was something else. Something closer to sincere. Jalen stared at him for a long moment. Then, with the faintest twitch of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he nodded. He didn't need to consider it. He'd already made up his mind a long time ago. Outside, the world was a different kind of chaos. Reporters crowded the steps like ants on a dropped candy bar. The questions started before he'd even made it to the sidewalk. Jalen, how did you know the GPS logs would back you up? Were you expecting a dismissal? Do you think Judge Grayson regrets the way he treated you? The microphones were everywhere, black and silver rectangles crowding his personal space like unwelcome guests. Camera flashes stung his eyes, but he didn't slow down. His hood was up now, his face shadowed enough that the headlines tomorrow would have to guess whether he was smiling or not. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They had already heard everything they needed to inside. At the bottom of the stairs, standing a little apart from the crowd, was his mother, Denise Dawson. Her arms were crossed over her chest, but it wasn't defensiveness. It was relief she didn't want anyone to see. For a moment, she just stood there, watching him the way only a mother could, like she was counting his steps to make sure he was still real. "You're not going to say anything to them?" she asked, nodding toward the reporters. Jalin shook his head. "Not today." She stared at him for a few more seconds, then let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside her for years. She stepped forward and pulled him into a hug so tight it left no doubt who'd given him his quiet strength. "You scared me half to death," she whispered. He chuckled under his breath. "Had to take a risk, Mart." "You always do," she said, but her hand stayed on his shoulder for a moment longer before she finally let him go. Across the street, leaning against an unmarked black car, stood Judge Walter Grayson. The arrogance he usually wore like a second skin was nowhere to be found. His arms were folded, his brow furrowed in something that might have been thoughtfulness. Or regret. Maybe both. He didn't call out. Didn't make a speech. But he watched them. And for the first time, it seemed like he was the one left with questions. Jalin turned his back on him without a second thought. He wasn't there for Grayson's approval. Not today. Maybe not ever. But the truth was, something had shifted in that courtroom. Something more important than just one verdict. For Jalin, it wasn't just about getting his charges dropped. It wasn't about proving he was smarter than Carrington or quicker than Grayson. It was about forcing the system to look at itself. And today, even if just for a moment, it had blinked. He knew that most people in his situation didn't get that chance. Didn't have the knowledge or the resources. Or the time. The world didn't make room for them to sit and study case law after dinner. He knew every alley. They didn't grow up with a mother who slipped old legal briefs under their cereal bowl because she knew one day he'd need to understand how to fight back. They got public defenders who were too tired or too scared or too outnumbered to win. They got cases that were over before they began. That's who he was thinking about as he walked away from the courthouse. Not himself. Not even his mother. But the others. The ones still inside. Sitting in those same uncomfortable chairs, praying their names weren't next on the docket. Wishing someone like him was sitting beside them instead of across the aisle. He'd promised himself once that he wouldn't end up here. Not like this. Not as the defendant. Next time, he told himself it'd be different. He'd be the one standing beside the table, tie knotted straight, case files in hand. He'd be the one people came to when they needed more than a speech. When they needed a chance. And maybe he'd even end up standing in front of someone like Judge Grayson again. But next time, the judge wouldn't smirk. Wouldn't dismiss him as just another clueless kid. Because next time, Jalin wouldn't be pleading for his own freedom. He'd be fighting for someone else's. He could still hear the echoes of the gallery in his head. The murmurs. The shifting. The way the air changed when the truth cracked open the story they'd all agreed on before they walked through the door. He could still feel that moment when everything started to tilt. When they all realized this wasn't going to end the way they expected. But for every Jalin Dawson who got a dismissal, how many more had already been forgotten? How many didn't get a chance to speak, let alone defend themselves? That was the question that kept him awake more nights than he cared to admit. And it was the question that made him realize this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was work to do. There always would be. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe it could matter. Later that night, as the city lights flickered against the smoggy sky, Jalin sat at his mother's kitchen table, staring down at the same textbooks he'd worn thin years ago. They still smelled like highlighters and determination. His laptop was open, tabs lined up with law school admissions, internship programs, pro bono initiatives. Denise placed a cup of tea beside him, watching him carefully. "You sure about this?" He nodded without looking up. "Yeah." She sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug. "It's not going to be easy." Jalen finally met her eyes. "It's not supposed to be." And they both knew that was the truth. The news was still running in the background, clips of the trial. Commentators debating whether Judge Grayson should step down. Headlines calling Jalen the kid who took down the system, as if it was that simple, as if it was over. But Jalen ignored it all. He wasn't interested in 15 minutes of fame. He was interested in 15 years of change. The next morning, his inbox was full. Messages from law schools, from attorneys offering to mentor him, from reporters wanting interviews. But the one that stood out was from someone he didn't expect. Megan Ortiz, public defender. The email was short, to the point. "I saw what you did. We need more people like you on this side of the table. If you're interested, we should talk." And he was. He really was. Because Jalen knew better than anyone that the system didn't fix itself. People had to do that. People who didn't just memorize the law, but understood why it mattered. People who refused to let things slide. People who didn't laugh when a kid asked for a chance to speak. He clicked reply, his fingers moving fast over the keys. He already knew what he was going to say, because he was done waiting. And so the story of Jalen Dawson didn't end with a dismissal. It started there. Because next time, he wouldn't be standing alone. He'd make sure of it. And maybe, just maybe, next time the courtroom would listen before it was too late. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about how justice works, and doesn't, then don't let it stop here. Share it. Start a conversation. Because change doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we make it. And we're just getting started.